So watch the video and see what story you come up with. So that's from an experiment from 1944. And this imagery has been used in multiple studies. And what they find is that people come up with stories when they're watching it. It's a bunch of shapes and some stick lines, but we come up with stories. And almost everybody comes up with the good guys and the bad guys in that story. Storytelling is something that we naturally do as humans. And there's actually like the neuroscience of storytelling. That's what the book Wired for Story is all about. It talks about the neurochemicals, how stories invoke empathy and emotion in us. They can be increased through character-driven narratives. And stories use our whole brains when we listen to them. Storytelling is part of human interaction. Now, back in 1895, early days of cinema, there's this recording of a train pulling into a train station. Now, the story goes that when people were sitting in the theater, which was where you'd be watching these films back in 1895, that when this train pulled in, it was the first time they'd ever seen an object like this moving towards them on a screen, and that people screamed, and some people got up and ran out of the theater. Now, this seems really absurd to us in our day and age. We're so used to seeing this type of imagery on television and in theaters and stuff flying at us. And if anybody's been to a 3D movie where it feels like it's coming at you. Now, compare that to the trailer from Paranormal Activity 4 that came out. And this is videotaping of people watching the movie.
Did you hear that?
What's up?
It's weird.
Alex, what's happening?
I just heard a noise. Hello?
So we still have extreme reactions when watching movies. Have you ever been in a movie where something happened and you jumped or you screamed? Or maybe you were really grossed out by something that was happening and you had to look away. Like, these things really do impact us on an emotional level. So we'll get to what Coke and Pepsi has to do with storytelling. But there's this really interesting study about Coke and Pepsi. So in the Pepsi challenge, if anybody remembers that, was people tasting Coke and Pepsi, and then people were always choosing Pepsi. If you actually go and look at the people that conducted that quote-unquote research for Pepsi, they actually talk about all the flaws in their methodology. But this was a study done that actually used fMRI machines to see what parts of the brains were lighting up. And the thing is like the chemical compound is very similar between Coke and Pepsi. And there's actually no correlation between stated brand preference and blind taste tests. In blind taste tests, there's an equal reaction to the brain. It's like the pleasure center that lights up from that sugary flavor. Now, the interesting thing is that when it was completely anonymous, they would give people three tastings, and when it was completely, or they'd give them multiple tastings, when it was completely anonymous, the number of times people selected Coke was, kind of even. Now, the semi-anonymous was they hinted that people were going to get Pepsi. And of the Pepsi drinkers, when they were hinted that they were getting Pepsi, out of their 3 tastings, again, people kind of picked one or the other. But when people were told that they were hinted at that they were going to be getting that what they were drinking was Coke, people selected it far more often, 2 to 3 times out of their tastings. So also what they found was only Coke showed an increased activity in brain areas associated with memory and emotion that did not happen when people were drinking Pepsi, even when it was Pepsi drinkers who were being hinted at drinking Pepsi. It only happened in Coke drinkers being hinted at that they were drinking Coke. And why is that? Coke's been selling this feeling, and they've always been selling this feeling of happiness. Have a Coke and a smile. There's rumors out there that Coca-Cola created Santa Claus in the image that we're used to in this big red suit with a beard, which is an urban myth for advertising. But it's a pretty powerful one, the number of times I hear people say this to me, especially when they find out that I work in advertising or research advertising. And of course, there's these lovable little bears that are super cute that they've been using for quite a while now. And I always get an interesting reaction when I show this to a crowd where most of the people are over the age of 50. Most of them remember this commercial. And when this image pops up, they do this, "aww" thing. Like, they have such a fond memory attached to this commercial. And in fact, this commercial was even kind of co-opted in the TV show Mad Men. And they kind of hinted about how this ad came to be through this ad man's brain. Now this one's a little bit closer to my era, the 90s, and Mean Joe Green. Lots of people remember these ads too. More 90s ads. And then in the 2000s, they started coming up with this Happiness Factory. And they had a lot of trailers before movies with these, is when you would see these frequently. And the thing is that stories are 22 times more memorable than facts. And there's different types of stories that you can use. And there's the overcoming the monster, the rags to riches, the tragedy, the comedy, the rebirth, the quest, the journey, and the return. Other ways to think about stories, especially for brands and organizations, is the origin story of how it got started. Some of the interesting ones that I can think of off the top of my head is like Nike. Ben and Jerry's ice cream is another one that has a good origin story. Tom's shoes, things like that. There's the customer stories. How often do we read reviews to see what other customers are saying? Or ads that talk about, like, customers talking about the brand or the company and what they've benefited. we can also think about like what we believe in and stand for as a brand. There's also the corporate responsibility stories. There's the passionate enthusiast. Think Chewbacca Mom for passionate enthusiast, or I think it's Patti LaBelle's Pies. That was another viral video that happened about the same time. The brand's purpose or reason for being. This is another one. Any of those companies that do the buy one, we give one, and there's quite a few of them. Like, that's a brand's purpose for being. Almost all of their origin stories come with this idea that we do this because we believe in doing this good thing for someone else. There's also like creating a ritual. And if you can think of any brands that have created rituals, the Oreo, the Twist and Dunk, that's a ritual that was created by advertising and something that's like really branded in the idea of the Oreo. For anybody that's ever drank a Corona, there's always putting the lime in the Corona. Again, that was a marketing technique used to get people to buy more Coronas. And there's a lot of other rituals that have been created around advertising. Other origin stories like Coca-Cola and it being created by a pharmacist. Boudin Bakery out in San Francisco, their origin story is that their mother dough, all of the sourdough that they make, and that's really what they're famous for, all goes back to the original mother dough from 1849. And then there's all of the technology and software companies that started in garages or dorm rooms. There's the ritual, the lime in the Corona, the Oreo. Having a coffee break was actually started by advertising. Orange juice for breakfast was another one. I want to say Florida Orange Growers Association had an overproduction of oranges and they didn't know what to do with it. And it was PR people that came in and were like, well, let's make orange juice a part of breakfast. Same with bacon and eggs. They wanted to sell more bacon. So they had a bunch of doctors. And this actually dates back to Barney's. Had a bunch of doctors, like, I think the surveys were kind of questionable on how they got their information, but they were able to say 9 out of 10 doctors recommend bacon for breakfast. They wanted to sell more bacon. Engagement rings is another thing that came out of the 1930s advertising. The diamond is forever. Show her how much you care and love with the engagement ring. They really weren't a thing prior to that. So, moment plus context equals story. And it's amazing that you can do this in 15 seconds. If you've seen any of the Geico commercials with the people like usually hanging there or sitting still at a table and then the dog comes up and eats something, and like they make a moment and a context and it creates this short little story and they do it in 15 seconds. There's this really neat video that I really highly suggest watching about the power of perception, and it talks about other times that persuasion of perception has been used. So I do highly suggest that you go and watch this TED Talk by Roy Sutherland. So some final tips. Speak truthfully when you're writing scripts for TV or radio and telling stories. Infuse the stories, whether it's a feature story or a TV script, infuse it with the brand's personality. Create characters your audience will root for, and that people want to connect with. I mean, even think of Mayhem for I believe Allstate. He's kind of like, he's not a great guy, but for some reason he's kind of likable and people like those commercials. So making that personal connection, however that is, usually with emotion, including a beginning, middle, and end. The middle is where the tension is. And again, I go back to those Geico commercials. They kind of have a beginning. The tension is that nobody's moving except for this one thing. And the end is, we told you our message so fast that you can't even skip it. And don't give it all away. You should look up the Unifying Theory of 2 plus 2 by Andrew Stanton. And perception is important. So this is one of my favorite things. It was said that he used to carry a card in his pocket everywhere that said, frankly, there isn't anyone you couldn't learn to love once you've heard their story. And I just think that's a really compelling idea that I want to leave you with.